Welcome to Optimal, the podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Dicken Weatherby, and this podcast and my website all focus on one thing, and that's the quest for optimal health. Our goal is to help your patients achieve optimal health so they can experience an optimal life. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google, and Spotify. And also make sure to go over to optimaldx.com and check out our resources on the site. Now, without any further delay, is today's episode. Hello and welcome to Optimal, the podcast. My name is Dr. Dicken Weatherby from Optimal DX, and welcome to today's show. And I'm joined as usual by Beth-Ellen in Naples, Florida. How's it going, Beth?
Hi, it's going great. Thank you.
Just went through Hurricane Idalia. So I think that's the second hurricane in less than a year, maybe. Hopefully that's it for the rest of the season. But I'm glad to hear you got through that okay. Well, today's guest, I am super excited about, someone that I've been following for many years. This is Dr. David Brady. Almost 30 years of experience as an integrative medicine practitioner, over 25 years in the health sciences academia, licensed naturopathic medical physician in Connecticut and Vermont, board certified in functional medicine and clinical nutrition, a fellow of the American College of Nutrition, completed his initial clinical training as a doctor of chiropractic. He is also the chief medical officer for Diagnostic Solutions Lab and Designs for Health, two very impressive companies. Is also the former long-term vice president of the Division of Health Sciences and director of the Human Nutrition Institute at the University of Bridgeport in Connecticut, where he continues to serve as an associate professor of clinical sciences. Maintains a private practice, whole body medicine, in Fairfield, Connecticut. He's also an internationally sought-after presenter on nutritional, functional, and integrative medicine, and we are delighted to have you today, Dr. Brady, on Optimal Podcast. So welcome.
Oh, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess it's a mutual admiration society. You said you followed me. I followed you. Well, I did more than that. I used your textbooks and a lot of your resources the way teaching laboratory diagnosis for a couple decades. So thank you.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you for those kind words. So tell us a little bit about, obviously you're wearing two hats with the Chief Medical Officer for Diagnostic Solutions Lab, and you're heavily in the laboratory medicine side of things, then also Designs for Health, and heavily involved in the nutraceutical field. So tell us a little bit about, kind of what, how that goes for you and sort of how you fit your clinical practice, and just sort of tell us a little bit about yourself and what your practice is like.
Yeah, wow. That's fun.
And we'll take a break in 20 minutes.
Crazy wild ride, but it's been a fun one. Yeah, like you said, I've been in practice for 30 years. I guess you can say I've been making mistakes and learning from them for 30 years. And a lot of the stuff I do and found and formulated or designed was just out of sheer desperation, right? Of needing something to do something or get something done for people who are in need. So that dragged me through the years into the therapeutic side of things. Well, with Designs for Health for over 20 years as their CMO, primary product formulator, and just lead the R&D innovation team and oversee clinical trials and a whole bunch of stuff and educating practitioners and the like. And before that, I worked with a bunch of other leading professional brands in formulation and in their translational science sort of educational efforts. But then I've been on the diagnostic side for a very long time, also worked with most of the laboratories that people would know in the space in some way, shape, or form. And then took a lot of that experience that I learned through the years in the laboratory space with some really super smart and equally experienced partners. And we started Diagnostic Solutions Lab about 7 years ago to do it the way we thought was the right way and really leverage a lot of, at the time, was very, very cutting edge emerging laboratory science that was really moving rapidly from the research world into the clinical world, and involves a lot of the different omics, microbiomics and metabolomics, genomics, proteomics, all of that. We were really wanting to leverage that, but with a functional, integrative, naturopathic medical twist to it, which is different than the way it's often used in more research settings. So it's been a really cool challenge, and I think we have succeeded in many ways in bringing a lot of really cutting edge, cool tools to our profession that can be used in people with chronic complex disease that we usually treat. So it's been really cool. And then, I had my whole academic side for 25 years in academic medicine at the end, the last 10 years overseeing the entire allied health science division for a university. So that was interesting and brought me into a lot of the different health professions, allied health and medicine and PA and nursing and everything else, from conventional to integrative. And along the way, I had the pleasure of teaching all those different professionals in training, mostly in differential diagnosis, laboratory medicine, management of complex chronic disease. So, and I've stayed in practice all that time, part-time practice now, but it's been a fun ride. It's been a big change over 30 years from when I started to now. I wish I had all the tools we have now 30 years ago. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, that would certainly be nice. I'm not sure how you even manage time for vacation and things with such a busy schedule.
Dr. Witherby, my adrenal glands are the size of raisins.
No, come on. Yeah. What do you know? That's why you're adrenal specialists, right?
Yeah. No, they're doing okay. Luckily, I'm one of those people who are a bit blessed at being a multitasker and kind of feeding. And I almost feel better and less stressed, and I do better just my core being when I'm doing a bunch of different things and busy and feeding my brain than if I'm chilling and relaxing. That gets me more stressed than being busy.
Yeah, right.
So you wear two hats. You're the chief medical officer for two companies that are major players in the assessment and diagnostic field, and also, but in the treatment world as well. And then clearly, post-COVID, but even before COVID, we were seeing a sort of an explosion of these very complex chronic diseases that have, like you said, a whole interplay of different biological systems and things like that. Just how do you see, given that you're in the diagnostic world, you're kind of seeing these markers that you're testing, doing the testing with the practitioners. And then on the other end, you're also seeing the supplements and the nutritional treatments. What's the interplay around the identification and the management of complex chronic disease in your experience?
Well, I think for a lot of my career, the management of complex chronic disease, at least I'm mainly speaking now from the functional integrative end of things. People trying to come up with ideas and hypotheses and ways in which they might help some of these people that had a whole constellation of symptoms. And, these patients, we all know them, right? We see them all the time. They're very, very difficult. And if it was easy to solve, they would have got it solved early in their journey. Usually, by the time they get to us, they've been through every conventional specialist known, and oftentimes either they've thrown up their hands and told them there's nothing we can do, or they're being just symptomatically managed and they're on 12 medications for 12 symptoms and do all other medications to manage the side effects of the first 12. So neither thing is a great solution for them, so they find their way to us. And sometimes I think it's just a matter of looking at what makes sense mechanistically and from a biochemical standpoint and their symptom standpoint, and kind of trying things. Right? It's a lot of therapeutic interventions and seeing what happens. And a lot of it is done with sort of this for that therapy, right? And particularly in nutrition. So when I trained a lot of nutritionists, I would always tell them, listen, it's human nature and easy to lean back on these paint by numbers. Everyone wants a protocol, right? What's your protocol? On these forms now. And I see the practitioners talking, hey, what's your protocol for pancreatitis? Well, it better be to get to the hospital and hopefully mess up them, right? What's your protocol for astrocytoma of the brain? It's ridiculous. But even in normal things, like what's your protocol for IBS? And I get the desire for those things, but that's very, very this for that nutrition, right? Give them this because I heard it's good for that. And often they're leaning on maybe some literature that's out there. Some of it's animal level stuff, some of it's human stuff. And luckily, we use therapeutics that generally speaking do no harm other than potential financial harm and just inconvenience. And a lot of people I see, they come in with GI problems and they're on so many darn supplements. If they didn't have GI problems before that, I'm not surprised they have.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So I think, we're rapidly having to move into a whole new game, and that is really, truly doing precision, personalized therapeutics on people. And in order to do that, not only do you need to do, really good histories and examinations, do good medicine, but you really need good precision diagnostics that can pierce deep enough to give you answers at the metabolic biochemical sort of level of really key core functions in the body, that you can find out where you're going to get the best bang for your buck and what are the most effective levers that you can change someone's functional outcomes and do it with the least amount of things possible. And that's where we're getting to now. It's not perfect, but it's way better than it was. It's remarkable to me how many people are not utilizing that, taking advantage of it, and they're still doing this for that protocol nutrition, which, you know what, in the end, when I'm speaking in front of crowds of whether they're nutritionists or other kind of functional docs that are still doing that stuff and not using a lot of personalized testing, I'm like, they don't need you. They can go and get your protocol, right? Or they can go to GNC and the person pulls up a protocol. I mean, that's the way to get you.
They could go to ChatGPT to get the protocol, right?
No.
Could you just answer them and say the protocol depends on the individual?
Yeah. And, you know, hey, listen, at Designs for Health, we have hundreds of protocols that we put out there because people just want them. And if that's all they're going to use, then we're going to do our best job at trying to give them ideas on what things to try in certain circumstances that have the best chance of helping. But at the same time, we're advocating, listen, there's probably a better way to do this, and trying to steer them toward those options.
So I feel like you've really answered a really big question for me. And the work that I've done is around functional blood and trying to get people to use a blood chemistry and CBC analysis to do exactly that. And obviously, our output is different than yours. With Diagnostic Solutions, you've been with them for 7 years. I know a little bit about the history of the company, but maybe could you enlighten our listeners as to kind of what type of testing Diagnostic Solutions does? And I'm fine with you doing a shameless promotion here because I want people to get this information because it's needed, and who better to get it than from you. So maybe just talk about Diagnostic Solutions. Why were you drawn to them as a company, or did you help form? I think you may have helped form the company, but I know that Dr. Richard Lord, I think he's been part of that group.
Well, I worked with Richard many years back when he was one of the brainiacs at Metabolomics labs. Yeah. And he's not part of DSL, although he's a very good friend of DSL. He's kind of in semi-retirement at this point from actually working with labs, but certainly I was very influenced by him. He's a sort of a mentor in at least that type of laboratory science to me. And then some of my other partners that I started DSL with, we did work together and cut our teeth, if you will, at Metabolomics. And it was a very innovative lab at the time. It was really the lab that was pushing things forward. And then the other labs were kind of copying what they did and then scaling it because they were bigger companies with bigger outreach and bigger marketing or what have you. But they were really the ones taking the chances and doing really cool, innovative stuff. So, and we worked together there, and then they got acquired, gobbled up, how the industry goes, right? And things changed, and it became more of a corporate thing. And we weren't really satisfied with that. And we weren't really satisfied with some of the stuff that was going on in integrative functional lab space. I mean, for instance, the GI testing, the stool testing was the same as it had been for 20, 30 years. I mean, nothing really changed. It was old school microbiology and sensitivity that really didn't work very well. Some kit-based stool chemistries. It really wasn't all that advanced. So we made that first stab at really bringing it into the molecular world at Metabolomics with their GI effects test. And then that got kind of
remember it well
and rolled in and changed. And there was a lot of learning curve with that test. It really showed us it was harder than we thought it was. And there was some really good parts about it and some limitations to it. But then, taking all of that, what we learned there, and then the science progressed, we started DSL. We're an omics shop, all right? And we're mainly a molecular biology-based shop. And our forte is really in molecular and in the GI space in quantitative PCR. So a lot of what goes on out there in, let's say, microbiomics testing is really more 16S sequencing, and it's not quantitative. It's really looking at what organisms are there and then what percentage of the DNA of the total microbiota of the gut is made up by a certain genus, sometimes species. 16S is not great at going to the species level in many cases, and it's not very good at all at strain. and it's not good at, you can't really tell functional characteristics of organisms. So it's really not the ideal way to test the GI environment from a microbial standpoint to make clinical decisions, like medical decisions, because it's not quantitative, it's just relative. So is really good for is research. Let's say you're a researcher and you're trying to say, well, what is different about the total compositional signature of GI microbiota in patients who have rheumatoid arthritis versus patients who don't, or people who have metabolic syndrome, or people in LA versus people in Tokyo, or vegetarians versus meat eaters, right? For that, you need sequencing because you need a 30,000 foot view down to the landscape, right? You need to know what all is there and what are the relative percentages of things. But when you're trying to make a diagnostic decision, does Mary Jones have a pathogenic infection, or does Mary Jones have dysbiosis with specific organisms? You can't use that kind of testing. You need to use targeted quantitative PCR, and that's what we do. We have a curated, highly curated list of organisms. Some of them, there's a whole list of acute pathogens, organisms that would cause overt symptoms generally. Things like Campylobacter and C. diff and anti-hemorrhagic E. coli and all the bad, Salmonella and Yersinia and all the real bad bacteria, and Giardia, Entamoeba histolytica, and so forth in protozoa, and then neurovirus, adenovirus, things like that. But then also using very targeted quantitative probes for your beneficial organisms or your commensals or keystone organisms. So everything from what clinicians tend to think of as beneficial organisms, which are things like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria, which are not really normally a substantial part of the human microbiota at all. Those are additive outside organisms given for some functional effect. But the real commensals that move the dial are different, and they include things that people have become more aware of in the recent few years, like Akkermansia, Muciniphila, Faecalibacterium persicii, and Rosburgia, and others. We're looking for those. And then we're also looking across a list of potentially opportunistic overgrowth organisms. So when there is overgrowth and you get symptoms often, gas, bloating, distension, things like SIBO, for instance, you have overgrowth of pretty predictable organisms. So we look at a whole list of these opportunistic organisms, including ones that we know produce methane and other kinds of gases that tend to cause symptoms, but we really zone in on organisms that we know can cause immune dysfunction. So various autoimmune triggers, your Klebsiellids and Citrobacter and Proteus and Prevotella and those types of organisms. And then we do a really good screen over all the stool chemistries. So looking at digestive and absorption markers, immunological markers, inflammatory markers, barrier integrity markers. So we mix all this quantitative PCR over the kind of landscape that the integrated functional medicine doctor wants to see. And some of this quantitative PCR is used in conventional testing, but only for pathogens panels, right? Just a small list of organisms that tend to cause overt acute diarrhea and things like that. So we're using that technology, and we've been able to come up with the methodology over a much larger landscape, and then combine that with stool chemistries. And that's on our flagship test, the GI map. And that's the leading stool test now in the integrated functional space. So that's where the lab came up being known as, but we're really a much bigger shop than that. We really much newer advanced metabolomics, including organic acids and other small molecules from, it's timed urine samples. Again, we looked at, organic acid panels and things that have been out there for decades. And we did a whole fresh sort of literature review on them. And a lot of those markers didn't have a lot of data behind them. If they did, it was like one animal study or whatever. So we really took a much more evidence-based approach to those legacy markers, which ones were good, which ones were a little shaky. And then we added a bunch of new ones that had emerged since those panels had been developed. And then we transferred it on to the latest, methodological instruments, right? The best way to do them. So that's our omics testing. And we do a lot of cytokine testing. You mentioned, COVID. We do a lot of long haul COVID testing and things like that for cytokine abnormalities. There's different aberrant cytokine signatures associated with different specific clinical conditions, and that can be used to not only diagnose those conditions, but follow treatment serial assessment. And then we do some immunology stuff. We do, some food sensitivity testing, but we also do genomics, and we do genomics a little differently in that we do all of our own sequencing and develop data sets. And then we have a couple of different options and tools to transfer that very large genomic data set into medical genomic informatics platforms that was designed by Peter Diadamo, one of the brainiacs of our and I worked with Peter hand in hand on this because I brought him to the University of Bridgeport to start his Center of Excellence in Generative Medicine originally. And we did his team did a lot of the work there and really refining Opus. And we use an iteration of Opus in the DSL testing called Genomic Insight. It's an easier version of Opus to use, so you don't have to be like this super high level genomics nerd. You could be a clinician that can just go in and it automates it a lot. So that's what we do. And we're adding different types of testing and stool metabolomics and other things all the time as they come out. We're working on some really cool anti-aging panels and just trying to stay really ahead of at the tip of the spear.
Fascinating. Well, thanks for taking us on a journey to that. Man, it's really,
I have a quick question. Can I ask a quick question? No. So with the testing, let's say you find some pathogens. What is your favorite natural antibiotic, and how do you get probiotics, if you use them, to actually colonize in the gut?
Oh, well, that's a good question.
Loaded question.
My favorite antimicrobials, if a lot of the older tests had these sensitivity tests, they call them, right, with or individual volatiles and things like that. Those sensitivity tests are not, they're not really worth the paper they're printed on, because they're not really indicative of what happens if you orally ingest that botanical or that volatile oil, okay? Because they're done in an aqueous solution with these organisms, and they do a translucence test, and they put this substance in there, whatever the botanical or whatever is, and then they wait a certain amount of time, they do another translucence test, and if the organisms were killed and sort of settled, there's a different level of translucence. It's not really directly weightable in any way that has any objective backing on how that relates to actually taking that herb or supplement in an oral form. It's not worked out to the level of, let's say, antibiotic sensitivity tests with different classes of antibiotics. But a lot of people lean on them. But in the end, I think most people use these combination type products, right? That combine various botanicals that have long historic use as safe GI antimicrobials, a lot of berberine contained botanicals and so forth. And they combine that with volatile oils. And that's really not a bad way to go. It's not only anecdotally with outcomes in the clinic, but, we've done some studies on it, did some stuff with Jerry Mullen at Johns Hopkins on this, looking at those type of approaches that are used commonly in functional and naturopathic medicine versus something like rifaximin or Xifaxan, right? Using a prescriptive, locally acting GI antibiotic. And actually the results are better with the natural therapeutics.
Yep, seen that.
The initial results are about the same, but the stickiness of the improvements are better with the natural stuff. And it's probably because with Xifaxan, rifaximin regimens, you're killing too much of the good guys. It's too much collateral damage. It's really amazing how some of the botanicals that we use in natural GI therapeutics are really kind of selective for really going after the pathogens and the opportunists at a lower dose than it takes for them to take out the beneficial commensals. So they're really beautiful therapeutic agents. I developed and formulated one many years ago, and have changed it, improved it over the years based on what I saw on stool test outcomes, called GI Microbex in the Exercise for Health line. I tend to use that a lot, and I combine it with our oil of oregano as a 1-2 punch just to cover the whole sensitivity spectrum. And usually that's taken sort of for a 3-week or so regimen fairly frequently, TID. and away from food. And then at the same time, we're backfilling with pro and prebiotics more with food. How to get probiotics to set up? First of all, I guess use good ones, use multi-strain good probiotics. It's nice if you can get them in a delivery system, the right kind of encapsulated technology that releases them where they should be released, using them in desiccant lined bottles, taking care of the probiotic until you take it, like the shelf storage conditions and so forth. And then you should be using a probiotic that actually has engraftment data, that they've done it in humans, not just simulated gut environments, but actually testing of engraftment, because that's really, really important. But probiotics are interesting. I think most practitioners in their training were told very wrong things about probiotics. They were kind of given that idea of the old 4R or 5R kind of program. Well, the 1R is reinoculate, right? Which kind of reseed the gut with the good bacteria, which means you don't bomb them with probiotics. The data is pretty clear that the level, and there's an arms race in probiotics. I don't know if you know. Really? Well, that's nothing. Mine is 200 billion. When it comes down to it, those numbers are statistically insignificantly different compared to the GI microbiome. Okay, so the numbers don't matter that much, because when you give a probiotic, which is an organism that fundamentally is not supposed to be there, like lactobacillus, really, what you're doing is you're introducing an outsider, and it's not to make it kind of colonize and crowd out all the other stuff in the gut, because it's not going to do that. It's really a messenger. It's a signal messenger to the mucosal immune system, and it makes big changes functionally by changing cytokine expression and a lot of stuff about the metabolome in the gut that we can objectively quantify, but it doesn't fundamentally change the commensal fingerprint, if you will, of the person's GI microbiota, only temporarily. Like if you do quantitative, it's transient. So you'll get higher levels of lactobacillus, let's say, on post-testing if you're using a lot of oral probiotics. But if you stop taking that probiotic within weeks, it'll go back to what it was. All right. So they're temporary therapeutic agents, where the goal is to come up with how to favorably change the true commensal fingerprint of someone. And right now, the biggest tools to do that are dietary changes, probiotics, postbiotics, things like that, polyphenols, some of the prebiotics, as we know. Sometimes the downside of those is people with dysbiosis, overgrowth, SIBO, you can make them worse. But
how about probiotic enemas?
I haven't used those a lot, so I can't really speak on clinical outcomes on those. I know we are working feverishly right now with partners on actually orally deliverable commensal organisms that are strict anaerobes and facultative, because now there's ways to lyophilize those organisms and to stabilize them in an oral delivery that we have engraftment data. And you're seeing some limited things like an Akkermansia product is out there, but we're looking to do this on a much larger scale, which would be akin to sort of like fecal microbial transplant results, but in a capsule. So it's kind of cool. That's developing very quickly.
There are options.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So let's coming back to the complex chronic disease element.
Yeah.
You're describing two things. One is an explosion in the testing that you're doing at Diagnostic Solutions, and the complexity of the information that you're providing. And now I'm looking at Designs for Health's website, and I've just looked on the microbial support, and there's like 4 or 5 different pre-biomed products. Yeah. It's like, so that it's not just the complex diseases that are an issue here, but it's like for the clinician, it's like the complexity of the diagnostic and assessment data. Well, I mean, the complexity of the treatment side of things. Yeah. So how does a clinician keep up? I mean, you're Superman. You've got to obviously live and breathe this stuff. And it's one, I love hearing you talking about your fluency is extraordinary. But how do mere mortals who may be listening to this go, well, I kind of like my protocols where I know what to do because it's easy, so
talk us through that.
How do they manage the data stream? How do they keep up to date?
Yeah, I get it. And you really went right to the heart of the matter, and not surprised. It is a brave new world, okay? And it's hard to keep up with, right? Because we used to suffer from the problem of not enough information, and now we suffer from an equally problematic issue of too much information. And what the heck do we do with it? So, and some of the solutions there are AI and machine learning and things like that, which we're harnessing and utilizing, and that'll only get more. But right now, for instance, with Designs for Health, I mean, we have a real vested interest in clinicians using our therapeutic products in the right way, at the right time, in the right patient, at the right dose for the best outcome. So we teamed up with DSL in a collaboration to put out what are called the Designs for Health Spotlight tests. And there's Metabolomics Spotlight, there's Genomic Spotlight, and there's GI Spotlight. And what they are is trying to harness the complexity of these multi-omics testing world, but write very high-level machine learning, really complex pattern analysis algorithms to decipher the data and then to make clinical recommendations. So it's kind of what spits out the other end after all the data's chopped up. You're getting the data presented to you, but more, instead of just marker by marker, it's more grouped in categorically, functionally, and you're given a sort of an algorithm score, like a power score, if you will, like a heat map score on each functional category, reach spotlight, as we call it. And then it's going to give you actual product recommendations, how to best, most efficiently use the DFH product line, if you're doing those tests, to meet the needs of that patient. And those were designed in particular for providers, let's say clinical nutritionists, health coaches, chiros, docs, physicians who just don't really understand all of this testing, don't have time to deal with it, don't want to deal with it, but understand the value in it and want to utilize it in their practice, but don't want to become sort of a lab nerd like me. So it kind of does the curating and the hard work and the interpretation for them and just spits it out in an easy way that they can deal with it and explain it to the patient. Okay. On the other end at DSL, they're offering more of the full on, this is the data, you interpret it. We have clinical support to help you interpret it. This is like even the next level up, right? For the person who really wants every single thing and they self-interpret it and there's no product recommendation. There's generalities, generic recommendations. So it's really kind of you pick your level in which you want to engage or dance in this stuff. But the landscape is changing. And let me give you an example where when we put out our Genomic Insight test at DSL, it was very hard to get the clinicians to understand what it was, because when the patient sends back their buccal swab and all the sequencing is done on over 900,000 SNPs, right? Well, you can't get a PDF static report of 900,000 SNPs. Right? What do you do with it? And I'm sure all the clinicians have people bring in like 16 sequencing tests or bring in 23andMe raw data and they slam it on your desk and it's 2 inches thick. They're like, well, tell me, interpret this for me. I have no idea. On these sequencing tests, I do this in the laboratory. I look at some of this stuff and I'm going, I've never even heard of it, right? Because they're clinically not relevant that we know of. So Genomic Insight, the way we dealt with that is the data set gets dumped into this medical informatics platform, which is Opus 23. And we have like a custom navigation portal of it called Opus Explorer. And that's part of the Genomic Insights test. And the clinician then can just click on that patient's data set and it opens up a whole world for them that they can go explore the person's genome, look at their SNPs in, let's say they're interested in cardiovascular, or they're interested in inflammation, or they're interested in cognition, or they're interested in methylation, or whatever it can be. They can go and explore in that area based on the clinical context of the actual patient that they're managing. And they can self-curate or they can use automated tools in there to tell them just, hey, these are the big ticket items found in this person's data set. And this is where you need to bolster them with, different nutrients or different dietary or exercise regimens, whatever it may be. So we are leaving rapidly the world of you send in a sample and you get back, the clinician gets back a static PDF with the lab results. We're going to be delivering big data to them, but mashing it up, curating it, making sense of it, and deliberating the action steps that would have the highest value targets for them based on metadata, because that's where it's going. We're trying to take what is being learned from all this research on metadata with omics, but bring it down to the level of the individual patient, which means for the clinician, okay, if we run all this stuff on somebody, I can't interpret all that stuff, have all of the brainiac design algorithms and AI and machine learning and stuff, chop it up and tell me what really matters from it and how we can do something about it. And that's what we're trying to do. But it's a real learning curve for the practitioner when they get a data set that they have to open up an informatics portal, then a PDF, right?
Yeah, we have you have YouTube videos too that are educational though too, to enhance the learning of the practitioner. I see them
all over the DSL website. There's a whole DSL academy with all that stuff. I'll tell you, when clinicians do get over the kind of the intimidation factor of it, if they haven't lived and breathed this stuff and they get into it, and we've done everything possible to create like a hold your hand through it. At Designs for Alpha and DSL, there's full clinical technical support people for clinicians to meet you at your level and get you up on this stuff. But once clinicians kind of get a taste for this, they're hooked because they see it. The lights come on. They go, oh my God, how can I ever practice without this stuff again?
All the pieces of the puzzle kind of can come together that way, and that's when it clicks.
And you can combine it with other things, when the serology stuff, like we don't do conventional serological testing, blood chemistry and CBCs and hormone panels and things like that. There's a lot of value in those too. And of course, especially if you look at them from the right perspective, but they're only meant to look at things certain ways, right? They're really designed originally, at least, to look for end organ failure, disease, serious problems. They leave some to be desired when you're trying to look at personalized metabolism and biochemistry and optimization and things like that. So they're just not the same thing. They both serve a purpose and they both can be looked at in various ways. But really the strength is to be able to combine in both of those types of aspects.
Exactly. We like to look at dysfunction too, of course, with the optimal ranges. We're not looking for end stage disease, but instead you're pathway to end stage disease.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I've always said to people is this is not absolute. This is just another tool that you can use to get a window into the human body and human physiology.
For sure.
And from my perspective, I think it's actually a very good entry-level test because it gives you a good lay of the land of what's out there. Yeah. And I imagine that, and it's just sort of formulating this question in my head was, so we've got complex chronic disease. I think of two sort of scenarios. One is someone has been previously diagnosed with a chronic complex disease. They're coming to an integrative medicine practitioner. How do they use the testing and then obviously deriving treatment and from the testing? But really, I think the most tricky cases is that patient that comes in, they don't necessarily have a quote unquote diagnosis. They're coming in, they're just feeling not right. And I'm wondering from your perspective, if you have kind of like looking at the DSL line, maybe sort of an assessment diagnostic triage, what would you start at first as kind of your, and what criteria would you use to maybe move into some of these omics testing? Because clearly you can't do them all. The complexity and the amount of data that you would receive would be overwhelming for anybody. So, if you don't mind, I think our listeners would love to know kind of like, okay, so I'm looking at the DSL website and there's a ton of stuff here. How do I tease it out? What's my route? How do I triage?
That's another great question. It really depends on the context of the clinical case. All right. Let's say someone was coming in and their main issues really were GI issues, right? Whether they're coming in having had a diagnosis of IBS, or maybe they have frank IBD, or maybe they just have a whole bunch of GI symptoms and that's their major complaint. Then honestly, I would probably start with a GI map because I really want to see what is the landscape of their GI environment, not only from the microbial standpoint, pathogens, opportunists, commensals, but also those functional stool chemistries. How are they digesting, absorbing? What's their immunological stance like in the gut? Are they in an inflammatory posture or not? Do they have likely gut barrier integrity, leaky gut issues? Do they have blood? Is there any dangerous things going on there? So I'd probably do a GI map because in functional integrative and naturopathic medicine, I think we all kind of agree that if someone's gut's are wrecked, they're going to have a hard time being healthy, right? So it's not a bad foundational place to start. However, if I had a patient coming in and let's say they don't have a lot of gut symptoms or they have minor gut symptoms, but their main issues are fatigue, post-exertional malaise, brain fog, those kind of things, then I'm probably honestly starting with an omics test, which OMX is our test, but it's Metabolomics. And there's a couple of different variations of that. The lowest level one would be just sort of organic acids. And then you go up to the full omics test, which adds a bunch of other small molecules and picks apart like amino acid metabolism and a lot more in depth. And then you can either do it all in timed urine or you can do urine and plasma. Some of the markers that are done in plasma, they're also able to be done with the urine sample, but the plasma is probably the gold standard for those markers. There's more data on the plasma, so we do offer that. But a lot of clinicians don't want to do the phlebotomy and things like that. And if you're just doing the urine version, you can just drop ship the kit to the patient, let's say, and they send it in. And it's an equivalent as far as I'm concerned. So probably the two biggest tests I do are omics, organic acids and small molecules under that Metabolomics banner, and GI map. And with Metabolomics, to me, is like what the blood chemistry, CBC, the lipid panel, thyroid panel kind of workup is in conventional diagnostic medicine. The foundation where you start triaging through this stuff with objective testing. That's what the Metabolomics test is to me in functional integrative medicine. And it doesn't replace the blood chemistry, CBC, all that stuff. That stands alone, and we do that too, because that's just normal. None of this supplies nuts and bolts medical diagnosis, right? Yeah. But it's an add-on. But the Metabolomics, you mentioned Richard Ward. I think Richard once said this, talking about organic acid testing at the time. He said, it doesn't tell you everything about anything, but it tells you a decent amount about a lot of stuff. You know what I mean? Like in its folksy Georgia kind of way. Is it tells you fundamentally, are the cells making energy? Are the mitochondria working? And if they're breaking down, is it anaerobic or aerobic breakdown? Where it is, where the metabolic lesions may be, and therefore what enzymes involved and what nutrient would be involved to catalyze it, and what you can do to try to therapeutically bridge it, right? But it's going to tell you also unique personalized need for really key enzymatic cofactors, because it's looking along the chain of biochemistry, right? So it'll really tell you to a much higher level than I think serum testing, for instance, do you need more specific B vitamins? And if so, which ones? Or specific minerals and things like that, because it's using functional outcomes to derive. But it's going to tell you a lot about, neurotransmitter status, because you're looking at metabolites of epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin, and catecholamines in general. And in our case of our omics, cortisol and those types of things. So that tells you a lot about patients who have anxiety and depression and insomnia and unrefreshed sleep and pain perception disorders and on and on. A lot of our patients, right? It gives you some information on detoxification. Are your routes of detoxification working fairly well? Are you being exposed to some ubiquitous toxins and struggling trying to process them? It gives you information on the GI tract, not like a GI map, but it'll give you kind of chemical evidence of likely dysbiosis or microbial overgrowth. And for digestion, are you producing a lot of putrefactive factors in the gut and leaving them there? And the microbes are feasting on them, let's say. It tells you if you're under a lot of oxidative stress, and I'm sure I'm leaving stuff out, but it tells you a whole lot of stuff to get started. Yeah. So it's like a triage test in a way. And then genomics, I probably use the least of the omics. And honestly, and I know that might be blasphemy to some people listening, because a lot of people when SNPs first came out thought they were the magical cure to everything and almost based their entire practice on SNP analysis. And oftentimes it's on a really small number of SNPs, right? So it's like methylation SNPs, like 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase. And I'm not diminishing the value of those, but, looking at specific SNPs or small numbers of SNPs is really extremely myopic. It's really looking down and a needle hole, right? And genomics are useful, but genomics are all about potential, right? It's what's more likely to happen or not. It's not really what's happening. It's what's more likely if Jupiter aligns with Mars, peanut butter on Tuesday and whatever, where metabolomics is actually telling you what is happening. So if I had to choose between the two, and there's value in both, I'm going to pick metabolomics all day long.
Because the individual's genes is going to affect how the genes are expressed. So the SNPs alone aren't going to tell you the whole story.
Just because you have it doesn't mean you have. Well, final question. We've talked about machine learning and AI. It's there. It's arrived. It's probably been here for a while that we haven't been aware of. What role do you see AI playing in the future of functional, integrative, and naturopathic and nutritional medicine?
Oh, man. I think it's a major.
We have 2 minutes.
It's going to be transformational, not only for our kind of medicine, but for conventional medicine. And I think it's actually going to be the thing that finally kind of blends the two, because it's by nature going to find the best. It always, like when I did my hospital rotations in medical school, it always blew me away that the different patients, same disorder, like a lumbar disc, if they went to the orthopedic spinal specialist, they got an incision 6 inches long. They got multiple segments fused. They're using drills and saws and playing, ZZ Top over the stereo and the OR. And then the other patient goes to the neurosurgeon. They have a suture, a incision that's a 1/2 inch long, and they're wearing microscopes on their eyes, and they're playing classical music. And they two totally different approaches to the same problem. And I'm told that medicine is evidence-based. Well, there's not enough evidence to tell you which way is better, right? It's not. It's an apprenticeship. So AI, I think, is going to tell us what's the best way to go. And it's going to be hard to ignore it just based on your apprenticeship or the old ways of doing things. It's going to be very declarative. So mainly we're using machine learning, and we're using complex pattern analysis algorithms. We're using a certain amount of AI. There's some AI elements to Opus 23, for instance, but it's just really starting to emerge on the scene and affect the diagnostic side of functional integrative medicine. It's already being used with differential diagnostic generators, right, where you put in patient symptoms and age, and pretty soon you're going to be putting in specific SNPs and a specific metabolomics outcomes and microbiomics outcomes, and then it's going to Dr. Watson it for you and pretty much tell things going on. It's probably going to be, it's already more accurate than people. Okay. It's a bit scary.
Well, Dr. Brady, thank you so much. This is the final opportunity in our podcast where we love shameless promotions. So please share with our audience anything that you're up to, books you've written, books you're about to write, upcoming webinars, training programs. Tell us about the latest omics testing from Diagnostic Solutions Designs for Health. People want to hear this stuff from our guests. So
thank you.
Let us know how people might be able to continue following you and your work.
All right, the book side, I'm not writing any books right now. I have no plan to, because the last ones I've written almost killed me. And whatever adrenal glands I have left, I'm sacrificed them. But I guess my latest kind of general book was called The Fibro Fix, and it's all about kind of dealing with the complex chronic illness, which is fibromyalgia. It came out in 2016. I wish I can rewrite the whole thing because we've learned a lot since then. But, I've a lot of textbooks out there and textbook chapters and things like that. But if you want to learn kind of more about my work, my research, my publications, and just some really cool content on the kind of patients I treat and everything, you can just hit my main website at drdavidbrady.com. So drdavidbrady.com, drdavidbrady.com. But if you want to learn more about a lot of the laboratory diagnostics and the omics testing we talked about, you can just go to Diagnostic Solutions Lab.com. So spelled out, Diagnostic Solutions Lab, no S, lab.com. Tons of educational resources there on that kind of testing. And then on the therapeutic side, just designsforhealth.com. And if you land there, one of the first things you'll see, I think, is a banner for that Spotlight testing suite I was talking about, with GI Spotlight, Metabolomics Spotlight, and Genomic Spotlight. They're the easiest version of real significant testing in this omics domain to use. There's a lot of Mickey Mouse stuff out there, particularly direct to consumer with these apps and stuff that really doesn't tell you much of anything that's actionable. So take a look at it. I think you'd be surprised at how easy it could be to use and help you differentiate your practice.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So that's designsforhealth.com is the place to go get those spotlight testings. So please go check them out. Because I think for those of you that might be just wanting to get your feet wet and just see what this is about, like you said, David, it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, and they're practitioner-based tests. They're not they're not direct consumer tests. Everything we design with the clinician integrally involved in it, because we really think the only way you get really good outcomes is to have that knowledgeable clinician involved in the process. Changes everything.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Brady, thank you very much. Beth.
Hey, thank you. Well,
thank you.
So, appreciate it very much. Everyone go over to designsforhealth.com, Diagnostic Solutions Lab, I think. Is that right?
.com.
Yeah, .com. DrDavidBrady.com, yeah. All right, Dr. Brady, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. And
thank you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.